Tonight, a tiny strip of water, smaller than some U.S. states, has the world holding its breath. The Strait of Hormuz. It is narrow, yes, barely 21 miles at its tightest point, but it is also the artery through which nearly 1/5 of the world's oil flows. And now, Iran's Revolutionary Guards have declared it closed to all shipping, closed to commerce. And more than that, they have warned that any ship attempting passage will be attacked. Consider that for a moment. A handful of gunboats, a few missile batteries, and suddenly the global economy could be at their mercy. Gas prices spike, stock markets wobble, families feel it at the pump, at the grocery store, at home. One narrow channel, and the consequences ripple from Tehran to Times Square. So here's the question, and it's a serious one. Are we witnessing the first real threat of a global energy crisis in decades? And if so, who is going to pay the price? You? Me? Or someone far away, watching oil tankers freeze in the Gulf? This is not distant news. This is not political theater for someone else's drama. This is very real, and the time to understand it is now. Let's start with the obvious, the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles across at its narrowest, yet it is the most consequential waterway on the planet. Nearly 20% of all global oil passes through it. That's 21 million barrels of oil per day in normal circumstances. Put differently, almost 1/5 of the fuel that keeps economies running, industries operating, and homes heated is squeezed through a strip of water narrower than some interstate highways. When we think of strategic choke points, we often imagine complex military operations, far-flung conflicts, or enormous armies. But here, geography alone is power. A few hundred missiles, a handful of naval vessels, and you can halt commerce, disrupt energy supplies, and trigger a chain reaction that touches every corner of the globe. Historically, choke points have always mattered. Remember the 1973 oil embargo, or the tanker crises of the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War? Those were times when a temporary blockade caused prices to spike and economies to stumble. Today, the stakes are even higher. Global supply chains are intricately linked. Just-in-time delivery, energy-hungry manufacturing, and international trade mean that a disruption here isn't localized, it's global. So when people ask, why does a narrow waterway matter so much? The answer is simple. It matters because energy matters. The world runs on it. And the Strait of Hormuz controls a large share of it. And let's not ignore leverage. Small countries, even those with comparatively modest militaries, can wield outsized power if they control the flow of something critical. Iran understands this. Geography gives them leverage. And leverage in international affairs is often the same thing as power. Now, here's something to consider. What happens if Hormuz closes for even a short period? Tankers are delayed, shipments halted, contracts unfulfilled, oil prices spike. Insurance premiums for shipping rise. Companies divert tankers, taking longer and riskier routes. And every delay costs money that eventually lands in your pocket. Gas prices, grocery bills, heating costs, all of it affected. This is why, despite its size, the Strait of Hormuz is not just important, it is vital. And vital areas are often the first to cause trouble in times of tension. Now, let's get to the question everyone is asking. Is this just bluster, or is Iran serious? Declaring the strait closed is more than political rhetoric. It is a move with immediate, real-world consequences. Every tanker that doesn't move, every barrel of oil that doesn't reach the market, every day of disruption, it is part of a deliberate calculation. Some analysts will tell you Iran wouldn't risk escalation. It's probably just posturing. But history suggests otherwise. Nations with even moderate military capabilities have repeatedly used strategic choke points to gain attention, exert pressure, and change the calculations of far larger powers. And make no mistake, the stakes here are enormous. Imagine for a moment a single tanker attempting passage. Even one ship being targeted would send shockwaves through global markets. Insurance rates for all tankers skyrocketing. Shipping companies halting operations. Oil prices jumping 50% or more in hours. Chaos would follow. And who benefits? Very few, certainly not ordinary people. This is why it's critical to consider intent. Is Iran trying to make a point, or are they actively testing global response mechanisms? If this is a calculated risk, it's a dangerous one for them, for the region, and for the world. Any misstep could escalate into direct confrontation. And let's be clear, the consequences are not theoretical, they are immediate, tangible, and costly. We must also consider the psychological element. A nation that demonstrates the ability to stop 1/5 of global oil is signaling power far beyond its borders. And signaling is often as important as action itself in geopolitics. It creates fear, uncertainty, and leverage. It is a classic strategy, one that works precisely because it exploits the world's reliance on energy. So when you hear, oh, it's just saber rattling, remember, the stakes are not small. This is leverage, pure and simple. It's an attempt to influence the world using geography and energy dependence as weapons. And history shows that when energy becomes a weapon, ordinary people are the ones who pay the price. The question now turns to the response. What are the United States and its allies doing about this? Because make no mistake, a closed Strait of Hormuz is not a hypothetical. It is an immediate threat to global energy security. The U.S. Navy is repositioning vessels throughout the Gulf. Tankers are being escorted. Satellite imagery and intelligence operations are monitoring every movement, every missile test, every military exercise. Allies from Europe to Asia are coordinating to ensure that critical oil shipments are not completely disrupted. But here's the problem. The Gulf is narrow, constrained, and vulnerable. Iran has anti-ship missiles, submarines, and mines capable of halting traffic entirely. A miscalculation on either side could turn this strategic standoff into a military confrontation. A single misfired missile, an accidental encounter at sea, and suddenly we are no longer talking about economics, we are talking about war. And pay attention to how carefully officials phrase their statements. Every comment, every press release emphasizes de-escalation, diplomacy, and caution. Yet at the same time, every movement of a warship, every convoy of tankers, every military exercise is a statement in itself, a message that says, in effect, we are watching, we are ready, and we will not be ignored. This is a delicate dance. It is strategic posturing with real-world consequences. The world often forgets that military presence alone can serve as both deterrent and provocation. Too little, and threats go unchallenged. Too much, and tensions escalate. Every decision carries risk, a risk that is borne not just by governments or militaries, but by everyday people relying on energy, trade, and stability. And this is where history offers a cautionary tale. Look at the tanker war during the Iran-Iraq conflict in the 1980s. Shipping lanes became battlefields. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Oil prices surged. Nations intervened to protect commerce, and the entire region remained tense for years. The lesson is clear. The moment a critical choke point is threatened, global powers must act, and ordinary people pay the immediate cost. Now let's consider the economic implications. Oil doesn't just fuel cars, it fuels economies. Industry, transportation, agriculture, and energy grids all depend on a stable flow of energy. When Hormuz closes, even temporarily, energy prices rise almost immediately. Higher oil prices translate into higher gas prices. Heating costs increase. Shipping and transportation expenses rise, affecting grocery bills and consumer goods. Inflation surges. Central banks scramble. Investors panic. And the most vulnerable economies feel it first and worst. The effects are global. Europe imports millions of barrels of oil from the Middle East. Asian manufacturing depends on energy imports. The United States, while more self-sufficient than most, is still connected to global markets. No economy is isolated. A disruption in Hormuz is a ripple that becomes a wave. Think about ordinary people. A spike in gas prices may not seem like a crisis to policymakers in Washington or Tehran, but for families budgeting monthly expenses, it is very real. Higher energy costs force trade-offs. heating or groceries, fuel for commuting or medical expenses. These are tangible consequences, not abstract figures on a chart. And let's not forget the financial markets. Energy uncertainty translates into market volatility. Investors react. Companies hesitate to expand or hire. Stock prices swing wildly. Retirement accounts are affected, pensions, savings, and investment portfolios all impacted by a geopolitical decision thousands of miles away. The consequences are not evenly distributed. Countries heavily dependent on imported energy feel the impact first. Countries with diverse energy sources or domestic production are somewhat insulated. But the reality is that a single choke point can destabilize not just local economies, but the entire global system. And there's a broader lesson here. The modern economy is fragile. Supply chains are tightly interconnected. Energy markets are global. When a critical artery is blocked, no one escapes the fallout. The closure of Hormuz is not just a regional problem, it is a global crisis waiting to happen. This is not just a short-term crisis. The closure of Hormuz, even for a matter of weeks, can have long-lasting effects. Consider the strategic calculations countries must make. Some will accelerate diversification of energy sources. Others will pursue alternative routes. Some may even militarize trade lanes to ensure uninterrupted access. The geopolitical consequences are significant. Alliances may shift. Countries may reconsider defense commitments. Energy dependence becomes a tool of influence, diplomacy, and, potentially, coercion. A temporary threat can evolve into a permanent factor shaping policy. And think about markets. Investors and corporations respond not just to current disruptions, but to anticipated future risks. If Hormuz remains a potential flashpoint, oil companies, traders, and national governments adjust their strategies. Contracts are renegotiated, investments are redirected. Energy independence becomes more than an abstract goal, it becomes a strategic imperative. There's also a military dimension. Nations may increase surveillance, station more naval assets, and invest in anti-access capabilities. The cost of securing critical waterways rises dramatically. Every dollar spent on defense is a dollar diverted from domestic programs. Every escalation carries the potential for miscalculation. In short, the closure of Hormuz could reshape global trade, energy policy, and international relations. This is why we cannot treat the threat lightly. Short-term disruptions may resolve, but the memory of vulnerability, the awareness of leverage, and the potential for future crises remain embedded in strategic calculations for years to come. History is unforgiving to those who react slowly. Nations that ignore choke points, that underestimate small but strategically positioned actors, often pay a high price. And in the case of Hormuz, the price is not theoretical, it is immediate, measurable, and potentially severe. So the question is not whether this matters, the question is, are governments prepared? Are businesses ready? Are citizens aware that a handful of decisions in Tehran could ripple across every corner of their lives? To fully understand the implications of a closed Strait of Hormuz, it's helpful to consider the analysis of experts, people who spend their careers studying energy, geopolitics, and maritime security. And their conclusions are sobering. Energy analysts warn that a protracted closure could trigger oil shortages unlike any seen since the 1970s. Consider the numbers. Even a partial disruption could remove 5 to 10 million barrels of oil per day from global markets. That is a staggering amount, enough to immediately send crude prices soaring, disrupt refinery operations, and cause cascading shortages across multiple industries. Maritime security experts are equally concerned. They note that escorting tankers through dangerous waters is costly, risky, and not a permanent solution. A convoy can protect a handful of ships at a time, but Iran has anti-ship missiles, submarines, and naval mines that could disrupt operations unpredictably. No escort operation can guarantee absolute safety. The stakes are high, and mistakes can be catastrophic. Economists have run the numbers. If the strait remains closed for more than a few weeks, global inflation could rise by 2-3%. That may not sound like much to policymakers in Washington or Brussels, but for ordinary citizens, it is very real. Higher energy prices increase transportation and production costs, which feed directly into food prices, housing, and healthcare. The most vulnerable populations are hit first and hardest. Experts also point out that energy dependency creates leverage. Nations that rely heavily on imported oil are at the mercy of geopolitical actors controlling choke points, like Hormuz. This leverage can be used deliberately to shape policy, gain concessions, or influence international behavior. And when energy becomes a weapon, the consequences are not abstract. They are tangible, immediate, and global. There is a pattern that history confirms again and again. When critical resources are concentrated in a small geographic area, nations with control over that area can exert influence far beyond their size or conventional military power. The 1973 oil embargo, the Iran-Iraq tanker wars, and various shipping crises all show the same principle: control energy and you control leverage. These are not theoretical scenarios. They are real risks, grounded in both historical precedent and modern energy infrastructure realities. Analysts consistently warn that a single miscalculation, whether by Iran or by responding powers, could trigger a cascade of economic, political, and even military consequences. Consider also the psychological dimension. Markets react to uncertainty. Even the suggestion of disruption can cause oil futures to spike, investors to withdraw, and national economies to adjust preemptively. The mere threat of a prolonged closure of Hormuz can reverberate through the global financial system long before any physical interruption occurs. Experts recommend vigilance, not panic. They urge governments to prepare contingency plans, diversify energy sources, and coordinate diplomatically. But they also warn preparation alone does not eliminate risk. The global system remains highly sensitive to disruptions, especially when critical choke points like Hormuz are involved. And here's the inconvenient truth. No amount of planning can fully insulate ordinary citizens from the economic ripple effects. Families may face higher utility bills, commuters may face rising fuel costs, and businesses may confront supply chain delays. These are the consequences of geopolitical decisions that unfold thousands of miles away, yet impact daily life here at home. In short, the experts make it clear. This is a moment to pay attention. It is not sensationalism. It is not overreaction. It is a sober assessment of reality. Hormuz is more than geography. It is leverage, risk, and consequence all rolled into a narrow channel of water, and the world cannot afford to ignore it. So what do we take away from all of this? First, understand the scale. A single waterway, barely 21 miles wide, has the power to strangle global energy flows, disrupt economies, and shake financial markets from Tehran to New York, London, and beyond. It is a reminder that in today's interconnected world, distance does not insulate us from danger. It's tempting to look away, to hope this is just rhetoric, that the world will somehow adjust, that markets will stabilize on their own. But hope is not a strategy. Global stability does not wait for optimism. It waits for awareness, for preparation, and for decisive action. The second takeaway is urgency. Governments must remain vigilant, markets must account for potential disruptions, and citizens must recognize that energy stability is not guaranteed. Every policy decision, every military movement, every diplomatic engagement in the region matters. Delay, indecision, or miscalculation can turn what seems like a manageable crisis into a prolonged, destabilizing one. Third, understand leverage. Iran may be a relatively small country in terms of geography or conventional military power, but by controlling the Strait of Hormuz, it can exert influence on a global scale. This is the reality of modern geopolitics. Strategic choke points magnify power, and small nations can wield outsized influence. Ignoring that fact is perilous. Fourth, the economic consequences are immediate. Higher energy costs hit families, businesses, and governments. Inflation spikes, markets wobble, and global trade is disrupted. These are not distant or abstract consequences. They are real, measurable, and unavoidable if the strait remains under threat. And finally, the long-term implications are profound. A crisis here is not just a short-term spike in prices or a temporary naval standoff. It reshapes alliances, accelerates energy policy changes, and forces nations to rethink their dependency on vulnerable choke points. The world will adjust, but the adjustments come with costs. Some countries will benefit, many others will pay the price. So, tonight, remember this. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature. It is a symbol of global vulnerability, a lever of power, and a reminder that the world's most critical points are often the smallest, narrowest, and most overlooked. The stakes are high. The margin for error is small. And in moments like these, the consequences are not theoretical, they are real, tangible, and unfolding. Watch the strait. Watch the markets. Watch what your leaders are willing to do, because the decisions made in Tehran, Washington, or elsewhere will ripple through every aspect of life, from energy bills to food costs to financial security. Do not assume this is distant or irrelevant. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz affects everyone. It affects you, it affects your family, and it affects the fragile system that underpins the global economy. This is not fear-mongering. It is sober analysis, and it demands attention. A single narrow waterway has the power to shape the fate of nations, the stability of economies, and the daily lives of millions. That is the reality. That is the story. And it is unfolding as we speak. So pay attention, understand the leverage, understand the risk, and recognize that in geopolitics, the smallest, most overlooked points often carry the heaviest consequences. Tonight, the Strait of Hormuz has made that reality unmistakably clear, and the world cannot afford to ignore it.